Hello, my name is Hewan Negash Teklu, and I'll be presenting as a legal counsel uh, for Stevenson Police Department um, uh, in favor of their decision for the inability to report to police work due to childcare problems for the case of Lisa Vincent. Um, um, Before we go further into the case, let's see the general overview. Without a doubt, combining a paid work with parenthood and responding to childbearing needs are not easy tasks. Employment and family roles normally encompass revealing responsibilities, as a child may require special attention or a spouse may fall sick. Mm, for many workers, their daily life is one composed of a juggling act between the demands and responsibilities of the workplace and the immediate needs of their families. Um, uh, Now that we see the general overview, let's see the highlights of the case. Officer Vincent had three children whom she regularly arranged for a babysitter to attend while she's on duty. She was scheduled to report to her station at 3 p.m. However, she was urgently rescheduled for her job at 11 a.m. with a very short notice while still with her family. Mm, This was after her supervisor had frantically tried to find a replacement on a callback arrangement. She tried to look for someone to be in charge of her family, but was never successful as she had already made arrangements for a babysitter at 3 p.m. She therefore failed to report on duty as commanded, instead, reporting at 3 p.m. as had earlier been scheduled. Her senior accordingly decided to suspend her from work for 5 days without pay. Um, so the important issues on this case are there are laws that govern the circumstances under which an employee can be suspended from work. The collective bargaining agreement provided the circumstances under which a police officer could be ordered to report to work. Um, Let me read this bargaining argument for you. Mm. What the collective bargaining argument says in Article 3 is it specifies that there should be 8 police cars on each shift. If for whatever reason there were not enough officers to staff a certain shift, officers would be called on a voluntary basis. Um, this was known as a callback. The callback method failed to obtain sufficient personnel for the shift in question. Police officers would be ordered back to work. This was called an ordered back. In ordered back situations, the department was first required to order officers scheduled to work the next shift in early. Mm. Therefore, employers should act in accordance to this agreement and other related labor laws before suspending their employees. So additional important issues are additionally the highlights should have sufficient reasons to suspend any employee. Mm, According to Nakomo, Fothler, and McAfee, the suspension period should be reasonable and the employee has the right to challenge his or her suspension in court of law. Mm. Arguably, it is commendable that Officer Vincent reported on duty at 3 p.m. despite having absented herself from the 11 a.m. schedule. This was perhaps an attempt to compensate the lost time, but she did show up at 3 p.m. Reasonability of the suspension. The reasonability of the suspension decision depends on the events that occurred prior to suspension. In the case where the employee is committed, there are provisions that needed to be followed to ensure that the employer's interests are fulfilled. The collective bargaining agreement through Article 2 outlines that the shift hours must be adhered to unless and under justifiable emergency. Um, and unfortunately, in the case of Officer Vincent, the case was not an emergency, a justifiable emergency. Points supporting the decision. Absenting from work meant that another person had to take responsibility and work on the behalf of Officer Vincent. This is according to American Psychology Association. Mm. This means that an efficient work would not be done because the officers would be covering their part as well as Officer Vincent's part. Not only did Officer Vincent absenteeism negate the provision of the collective bargaining argument, but it also affected staffs that were on duty at that particular time. This is also according to Michelle and Niramala. Mm. The legal provision. As provided by the law, employees are not justified to absent themselves from work without permission from their employers. This is according to Anne and Bud. In the case of absenteeism without prior permission, the employer is justified to initiate disciplinary actions on the employee, including suspension or dismissal from work. Um, now that we saw the general overview and the highlights of the case and the legal provision, we're going to see the conclusion of the case, my conclusion of the case. The department is justified to suspend Officer Vincent on the following grounds. Officer Vincent was expected to work on the mentioned date and time, but did not appear to work. The officer did not notify her employer prior to her failure to report to work. Neither had she prior permission to do so. And the excuse given for her absenteeism is personal and does not qualify as an emergency situation to deter her from her being on duty. The failure to attend to work amounts the negligence of duty on the part of Officer Vincent as a part of the disciplinary action to bar the officer from repeating the same mistake. The department is justified to impose disciplinary actions on the officer. Suspension is fair and reasonable from a disciplinary action for the action of the officer. However, it is commendable that the officer reported to duty at 3 p.m. despite absenting from her emergency schedule. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.